The flight attendant placed a napkin on my tray. Her fingers trembled as she did it. Scrawled across the thin paper in hurried ink were the words, "Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane right now." I looked up at her, stunned. Her eyes weren't annoyed or distracted, they were wide with fear, the kind that strips away every practiced smile. She leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Please," she whispered, "I'm begging you." In that moment, I had no idea whether this was a misunderstanding, a cruel joke, or something much darker. But what unfolded 2 hours later proved one thing beyond doubt. That warning wasn't imagined. It was the reason I'm still breathing today. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. This story could happen to anyone. My name is Isella Warren. I'm 30 years old, a travel nurse who has witnessed more pain and loss than most people see in a lifetime. I've stood at bedsides as monitors went flat. I've wrapped families in silence when words stopped working. After months of relentless shifts, I finally took a break to surprise my mother in Boston. She'd recently survived heart surgery, and she kept saying my voice helped her recover faster. I couldn't wait to see her face when I showed up unannounced. That afternoon at LAX felt ordinary in every way. Travelers laughed, kids pressed their noses to the windows, business people typed furiously on laptops. I felt exhausted but calm, whispering a quiet thank you for the first stretch of peace I'd felt in a long time. As I boarded, the flight attendants greeted passengers with automatic smiles, all except one. Her name tag said Alyssa. She wasn't just welcoming people, she was watching them. Her eyes tracked each passenger like she was committing faces to memory. When our gazes met, she froze for a heartbeat, as if startled, then looked away too quickly. My seat was an aisle spot near the middle of the plane. Across from me sat a man in a black jacket who kept adjusting himself, opening the overhead bin twice without putting anything inside. Next to him, a teenage boy clutched a backpack tightly to his chest, shoulders tense. Nothing was obviously wrong, yet the air felt heavy, like something coiled beneath the surface. I texted my sister Chloe that I'd boarded and Mom had no idea I was coming. She replied with hearts and reminders about cookies from the terminal bakery. I buckled in, exhaled, and tried to relax. Then I saw Alyssa again. She moved slowly down the aisle, pretending to check compartments, but her focus wasn't on bags, it was on people. She looked afraid of someone, though I couldn't tell who. When she reached my row, she leaned down as if setting a napkin on my tray, never changing her expression, never meeting my eyes. Then she walked on. I unfolded the napkin. "You are not safe. Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane immediately." My thoughts stalled. For a second, I convinced myself it had to be a prank or a mix-up, but when I looked up, Alyssa had stopped at the end of the aisle. She turned and met my eyes. There was no humor there, only urgency. My heart began to race. I scanned the cabin. No one else seemed alarmed. No other napkins, no whisters. Whatever this was, it was meant for me alone. I didn't know why, but I knew I couldn't dismiss it. If you want to know what happened when I stayed seated and why this flight changed my life, stay with me. Don't forget to subscribe and comment your city or country below. This story the world needs to hear. The napkin felt heavy in my lap, like a live wire. Every word echoed in my head. I tried to stay calm, watching Alyssa from the corner of my eye. She stood near the galley, posture rigid, gaze fixed on two passengers a few rows ahead. Not casual, alert. I told myself she'd made a mistake, that I was spiraling, but then she glanced at me again, and I saw it. Pure fear. That look erased every rational excuse. I scanned the cabin more carefully. A man in a gray hoodie sat stiffly, gripping the armrests. A woman in a business suit tapped her foot, eyes darting toward the front. But it was the man in the black jacket near the emergency exit who unsettled me. He wasn't anxious, he was waiting. His eyes flicked between the cockpit door and Alyssa, controlled and focused. Then I noticed the overhead bins in first class. They were sealed shut with yellow zip ties. I'd seen that only once before, during a safety briefing about security threats. My training kicked in. This wasn't random. This was containment. Alyssa suddenly stepped toward me, pretending to check my seatbelt. She leaned in so close I could feel her breath. Do it now. Say you feel faint. If you stay on this flight, you won't land alive. Her fear in her voice wasn't for herself, it was for me. She straightened and moved on, smile fixed in place. I reached for the call button, then hesitated. What if drawing attention made things worse? Before I decided, a loud thud echoed from the back of the plane. Heads snapped around. A male flight attendant rushed past, his face drained of color. Behind him, the teenage boy with the backpack was hyperventilating, whispering, "I can't do this," over and over. The engines shifted pitch as the plane picked up speed. My pulse thundered. Once airborne, there'd be no turning back. I glanced at the terminal slipping away and felt a certainty settle in my bones. This moment mattered. My phone buzzed, a text from Chloe asking for a photo. I typed back, "Something's wrong, pray for me," and hit send. My vision blurred as dizziness washed over me, real and overwhelming. Doing nothing suddenly felt like the worst choice. I unbuckled and stood. Murmurs rippled through nearby rows. The man in the black jacket turned slowly, his eyes cold and calculating. Before I could falter, Alyssa was beside me, her hand firm on my arm, guiding me forward. "Follow me if you want to live," she said softly. She spoke loudly for the cabin, saying she'd get me water, but whispered warnings as we moved. "Don't look back, someone is watching you. Your seat was chosen for a reason." She sat me near the exit, the other attendant pretending to prepare oxygen. Her lips barely moved. "They think you're someone else. If you stay in that seat, they'll act once we're cruising." My mind raced. Mistaken identity, targeted seating. Alyssa slipped a small device to her colleague, a silent exchange passing between them. As she called the cockpit, her composure cracked just enough to reveal the strain. Then she locked eyes with someone beyond the curtain, her expression hardening. Moments later, the captain announced a delay and a return to the gate. The atmosphere changed instantly. Passengers began murmuring in irritation, groaning loudly. But beneath the surface noise, I sensed something deeper. Panic from certain individuals whose plans were being disrupted. The man in the black jacket stood fully now, his calm demeanor gone. He glanced toward the cockpit door, then at me, then toward the overhead bins like he was calculating every angle. Behind him, the quiet teenage boy clutched his backpack even tighter, his lips moving rapidly as if he were praying. The woman in the business suit pulled out her phone and started texting furiously, her hands trembling. Alyssa positioned herself between me and the aisle, blocking their line of sight, as if she knew any sudden movement toward the exit could trigger chaos. "You need to choose right now," she whispered while keeping a professional smile.
"For appearances. If you get off this plane, your life will be turned upside down. But if you stay, you will not get another chance to leave alive." My heart slammed against my ribs. I thought of my mother waiting in Boston, thinking I was just hours away. I thought of my sister, probably laughing in her dorm room, editing a funny video about surprising mom. Then I thought of the fact that if Alyssa was right, my family would never see me again. The plane was now turning back toward the terminal, but we were still moving. If the threat was desperate, they might act before we even reached the gate. Alyssa unbuckled and moved to the intercom. Her voice remained professional, but I caught the slight tremor in it as she said, "Flight attendants, prepare doors for arrival." The engines slowed. The runway lights reflected off the windows. Suddenly, the teenage boy stood abruptly, his face pale. "I need to get off this plane. Please," he said loudly, his voice cracked with real terror. A ripple of confusion ran through the cabin. It was clear now, I wasn't the only one who had been warned or threatened. Before anyone could react further, the man in the black jacket reached into his carry-on with a deliberate motion. Alyssa immediately stepped forward, raising her hand sharply. "Sir, please take your seat," she commanded. But he froze mid-motion when he noticed the cockpit door opening and two uniformed air marshals stepping quietly into the aisle from first class. It was then that I realized this entire situation was far more complex than one crew member acting alone. There was already an active federal operation in place, and somehow I had been placed right in the center of it. As the air marshals moved down the aisle, disguised as regular passengers until that moment, Alyssa looked back at me and said softly but firmly, "You were never the target, but now you are the key." My breath caught. Every nerve in my body told me this moment, right here, was the dividing line between my old life and whatever was coming next. I nodded once. "I want to get off this plane," I said out loud, my voice steady even though my hands were trembling. That sentence was my decision. Alyssa exhaled as if she had been holding her breath. She stepped aside, signaling to the air marshal. The plane hadn't even stopped moving before the marshals secured the aisle and prepared for immediate evacuation. I had made my choice, and there was no going back. The plane had barely come to a full stop when everything erupted at once. The seatbelt signs were still on, but 2 federal air marshals were already moving down the aisle with controlled urgency. Passengers hadn't been told the real reason for our return, so confusion spread in murmurs that quickly turned into alarm as one of the marshals reached the row where the man in the black jacket sat. Instead of complying, the man stood up slowly, his expression unfazed, almost bored. His cold eyes darted first to me, then to the cockpit, then back to the marshal approaching him. In that instant, his hand slipped into his jacket. Before he could pull anything out, the marshal shouted a command, and the man froze, realizing he had been outmaneuvered. But that was just the first trigger. A second man, seated near the emergency exit, suddenly lunged toward the door lever. The entire cabin gasped. A flight attendant leaped forward to block him, but he shoved her back with surprising force. The teenage boy in the back screamed, "Don't open it! It's not what you think!" His voice wasn't scared, it was devastated, like he knew something horrifying was about to happen. Passengers began panicking, some ducking down, others shouting. Children cried. The woman in the business suit, who had been nervously texting, stood and tried to push past people, only to be restrained by a second marshal. She yelled, "You don't understand, it's about to activate." Her face had drained of all color. The words sent a jolt of cold electricity through me. Activate? What was about to activate? I looked to Alyssa, who was already pressing urgently into the intercom, her voice firm. "Remain in your seats. Do not touch any overhead compartments." Her calm tone didn't match the fear in her eyes. She stepped into the aisle and nodded to one of the marshals, who then reached up and pulled down a specific overhead bin, the one right above where I had originally been assigned to sit. Inside was not a bag. It was a sealed, wired device the size of a lunchbox with a small, blinking indicator light. The cabin went silent. People stared in disbelief. The man in the black jacket smirked, not in victory but in satisfaction that we had finally seen the truth. He had expected this moment. Agents moved with rapid precision. One secured the man, zip-tying his hands behind his back as he stared straight ahead, like he had already accepted his fate. The other agent used a scanner on the device, but didn't touch it. Alyssa stepped closer, never taking her eyes off the criminals, while the teenage boy continued repeating, "It wasn't supposed to be here today. They switched the flight. They switched the target." His voice trembled with guilt. He wasn't an accomplice. He was a witness, or worse, someone being forced into involvement. The cockpit door swung open and the captain emerged, face pale. He looked directly at Alyssa. "Is it live?" he asked. She nodded grimly. The tension in the air was suffocating. Alyssa then turned to me with a look that made my heart drop. That device was placed under seat 14C, your seat. My breath caught. I had been assigned 14C only that morning after I changed my booking to an earlier flight to surprise my mother. My seat change had not been random. It had been intercepted. If I hadn't gotten that napkin, if I had stayed seated, if Alyssa hadn't noticed the switch, I wouldn't have made it off that plane alive. But the nightmare didn't end there. As law enforcement began evacuating passengers row by row, the woman in the business suit continued yelling to anyone who would listen, "It's remote triggered, there's someone on the ground." Those words ignited a new wave of terror. The marshals mobilized immediately, alerting ground control. Emergency response units surrounded the plane. Everyone was being rushed out through the rear door, farthest from the device. When my turn came, Alyssa placed a steady hand on my shoulder. Her voice was low and calm. "It was never about you. They thought a federal informant would be sitting in your seat, someone with sensitive documents. They targeted Flight 14 for a political assassination. You boarded in their place without knowing." As we stepped onto the jet bridge, I saw 3 men in tactical gear sprinting down the corridor toward the terminal. Something was still happening. I heard shouting from the gate area. People were running. The teenage boy, now in protective custody, looked back at me with tears in his eyes and said, more to himself than anyone, "They said no one would know. They said no one would get hurt except the target." It became clear this wasn't random violence. It was a calculated hit designed to look like an accident in mid-air, a cover operation, and I had almost been the face on every news broadcast in the country. Just as I stepped fully into the terminal, my phone, still in airplane mode, buzzed repeatedly the moment it reconnected to service. Texts from my mother, my sister, missed calls from unknown numbers, then a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. I pressed play, my hands shaking. A distorted voice said, "We know you got off the plane."
This is not over. That was the moment I realized I was not just a survivor. I was now involved in a battle I never asked to fight, and the people behind this weren't finished with me yet. I stood in the terminal, surrounded by flashing lights, federal agents, and panicked passengers. But in that moment, every sound felt distant, as if I were underwater. The voicemail still echoed in my mind. This is not over. I could feel my hands trembling, not just from what almost happened, but from the reality that I had unknowingly stepped into something far larger than myself. A female agent approached me with a firm but compassionate expression and said I would be taken to a secure holding area, away from the public. She explained that the suspects were part of a domestic extremist group that had been plotting targeted attacks disguised as aviation accidents. They had identified a specific federal whistleblower who was supposed to be traveling on this flight under a protected identity. That whistleblower had canceled at the last minute without their knowledge. My seat, the one they targeted, was originally assigned to him. That was when it hit me. I was alive not by chance, but because a woman I had never met chose to act on instinct rather than routine. If Alyssa had ignored her gut feeling, if she had shrugged off the seating change, if she had been even 1 minute too late, I would have been part of a breaking news headline, not a living person telling my story. As federal agents led me away, I passed by families hugging one another, passengers crying with relief, and people angrily demanding answers from airline staff. Their lives had been disrupted, their travel plans ruined, but in time they would understand. Those inconveniences had saved them. I was escorted to a small private room where I finally saw Alyssa again. She no longer wore the composed expression of a flight attendant. She was an undercover federal agent, and that napkin was not just a warning, it was the first step in saving hundreds of lives that day. When our eyes met, I broke down, not with fear this time, but with gratitude. She walked over and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "I need you to know something," she said softly. "You were never supposed to be in danger, but when I saw the look in your eyes, I knew you were strong enough to hear the truth." Her words settled into my heart. All my life, I had been the one helping others, patients, families, strangers in crisis. But on that day, I had to rely on someone else to save me. Over the next several hours, I gave my statement. I learned that the teenage boy had been coerced by the extremist group and had quietly tried to signal distress by clutching his backpack. The woman in the business suit was actually an embedded agent from another branch, monitoring the suspects from a different angle. Multiple agencies had been tracking this operation for weeks.
The decision to stop the flight was not random. It had been triggered the moment Alyssa slipped me that napkin. Because I reacted, because I moved, because I did not ignore the warning signs, what I thought was fear became my greatest protection. What I thought was panic was actually clarity. Later that night, I was driven to a secured hotel with federal protection. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from family and friends who had seen breaking news about a major threat prevented at LAX. My sister finally got through on a protected line, sobbing with relief. My mother's voice cracked when she heard mine. I felt the tears fall down my face as I realized how close I had come to never hearing her voice again. I expected to feel weak, traumatized, broken, but instead I felt something unexpected: purpose. If this had been my last day on Earth, I would have left without telling the world what I had seen, what I learned, that danger often hides behind normal moments, that a single warning can save your life if you are willing to listen. In the days that followed, I cooperated with authorities as they dismantled the larger network behind the attack. My story was never released to the public in full detail due to ongoing investigations, but what I went through changed the course of my life. I stopped living passively. I started paying attention, not with fear, but with awareness. I made a promise to myself that I would never again dismiss my instincts or ignore the signs others tried to give. Today, I share this story because you deserve to know that sometimes your life hinges on a choice you never expected to make. You may never be handed a napkin written with a warning, but you might feel uneasy about a situation, notice something off, or hear a voice inside you telling you to act. Don't ignore it. Your instinct is not panic, it is protection, and sometimes protection comes in the form of a stranger begging you to listen. If this story opened your eyes or made you feel grateful to be alive today, make sure you subscribe right now and comment where you're watching from. Your comment might remind someone else to pay attention, and that reminder could save a life.